Let's talk contrast. Now, right off the bat, you're probably wondering, why did he put contrast so tiny in the bottom left corner of his page? Well, it's to prove a point straight off the bat. Because contrast is written in white, and I have a big black void of darkness here as a backdrop, your eye immediately went straight to contrast, even though I wrote it really tiny in the corner. And that's going to be the first thing about contrast. It's leading the eye of the viewer to what I want them to look at based off a certain set of choices that I make within my picture. By now, you guys know me, and you know that I'm going to break this down into some rules. So there are types of contrast. Different artists will definitely see this differently, but the way I like to look at it is there's three major types of contrast. You have color, you have texture, and you have shape. Now, this is in no particular order. There is no hierarchy when it comes to contrast, and in fact, most of these are used all together. Now, the reason I say that some artists might not agree with these three tiers here is because realistically, there is more to it. To simplify, I just like to keep these as subcategories. So under color, we have temperature, hue and saturation, value, which is light and dark. We'll talk more about that when we look at some visual examples. Under texture, we have edge and detail. And then under shape, we have size. And then I also just want to say that shape itself is a type of contrast. Now, the reason I say you're going to see a bunch of artists explain this differently is because some will consider each one of these their own type of contrast, which yes, they are, but I think it's more helpful to see them as three big categories that have subcategories. That's how my brain works. Hopefully it's how yours works too. Now, just before we go to the next slide, I just want to say, if you find that your eye keeps going up here for some reason, you might not have noticed, but I put all this text as a mid-tone kind of gray, a mid-value gray, and I left that top one as white. Actually, not even full white. It is still slightly gray. So again, contrast. Look, it's working right in front of your face. All right, let's get to some real examples. Now, under color, our first category was temperature, and essentially temperature just means warm versus cool, or vice versa. So let's start with warm versus cool. So let's say we have some sunset colors. I have some picked out in my gradient tool. So I'm just gonna throw them across here. And what we can do is throw in some cool colors. So now immediately, if I just throw in a blue, right? Pretty standard. We all think of blue when we think of cool colors. You guys can see that immediately now your eye is just drawn to whatever this is. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a square. It can be a circle. It can be a star. It doesn't matter what the shape is necessarily. Not for this one, we're gonna get the shape eventually, but it just matters the temperature. So as long as you can understand and know the color wheel, and you kind of have an idea of cool colors versus warm, you really can mess around with anything. So let's reverse this picture. So same concept, but now we're doing cool versus warm. So it's really the same thing. No matter what I draw in, as long as it's going to be on the warm side of the spectrum, you guys are going to see it start to kind of contrast and bring your eye towards it. And yes, it can be desaturated as well, as long as the eye can still tell that it's a warmer hue than the color in the background. Really quick, before we get to the rest of the color tiers that I mentioned, I do want to mention another one, an honorable mention, if you will. I didn't put it on the list because I feel like it's kind of self-explanatory, but just in case it isn't, complementary colors are always contrasting with each other, and it's generally going to be based on size. So if I have a green square, and of course we go full Christmas, and I draw the Jolly Red Man's color over here, no matter what size I make it, it's going to draw your attention there. Now, while you guys are accustomed to complementary colors, and if you're not, you can always check out my color wheel video that I did a little while back. A common mistake that artists make when we're talking about colors is oversaturation. So that's going to bring us to our next category, which is hue and saturation. So it's important to remember that just because we want that red and green, let's say, contrast going on, it doesn't necessarily mean that one or the other has to be super saturated. What does that mean? Let's just take a look at this red, for example. This red right here and the arrow I just made are almost fully saturated colors. Saturated meaning almost as pure and bright red as it can be. That being said, if I want this complementary contrast happening, it doesn't have to be that way. If I replace that red with a much more neutral red, you can see that the contrast still exists. Now, the situation that's happening here is a lot less in your face. It's more subtle, and that's not a bad thing. But That being said, here's how you can use it to your advantage too. So taking a look at our purple situation here, now if you notice, this purple is very dull. You might actually not see it as being as dull as I'm talking about because the yellow contrasting with it actually gives it a nice vibration and a play. What you might be thinking is the color with the most contrast now is the color with the highest saturation, but that's not always going to be the case. Let's reverse this and do a really bright purple. Now that's a bright purple. It's actually hurting my eyes to look at. So the thing that you're going to naturally gravitate towards is you're going to say, I want to draw the brightest yellow now. And you can see this is like, it's a really harsh vibration. It actually kind of hurts to look at for too long. And it doesn't always have to be like this. If I were to just go with a much more desaturated yellow, the contrast still works and it's still focusing on this yellow color. Even if you were to go for a more darker and kind of muddy looking yellow, you can see that the purple, it just still vibrates with that yellow and it makes it work, and the contrast still comes to the complementary color, even though the saturation is not quite there. So this is how we're playing with saturation, desaturation. We have a saturated background and a desaturated focus. So now we get to value. The easiest way to explain value is obviously going to our value scale, which I've talked extensively about in past videos, and just understanding the idea that light and dark play off of each other. In fact, what you're seeing on this page is a play on values. Your eyes are focused on this white square in the center that I want you guys to look at as I draw my diagrams. So that being said, let's just kind of take a practical look at this. So I'm going to do a really quick and sloppy kind of painting here. I'm going to start in the background with a nice kind of lightish gray, and I'm just going to start moving down my value scale as I start to fill this in, okay? It's going to be very rudimentary. This would be the perfect example. Maybe not perfect because it doesn't look so pretty, right? But this would be the example of what it would look like for value in terms of contrast. We have what I want you guys to look at, which is that foreground right in front of you. It's the darkest, it's the most solid of the values. I went full black for it, so I'm really calling for your attention there. Nothing else is fully one way or the other. We have a bunch of mid-tone grays, so your eye is drawn in a certain direction. Now, the reason it really helps to understand how values move back in space and how you can play with this contrast is just because if we did have both ends of the spectrum on here, you can see that now we're having fighting contrast. We're having fighting focal points. You really can't tell. It almost, again, it kind of hurts to look at, just like those complementarily really bright saturated red and saturated green kind of colors, right? But if we go back, you can see that there is now a nice hierarchy of scale, and my eyes know exactly where to look. And just as an example, I do want to show that this works with color as well. Value doesn't necessarily mean black and white. It just means light and dark. So now we're on texture and we're looking at edge, and the easiest way to explain this one is just going to be sharpness. So if I drew something that's very blurry, kind of cloudy looking, and then next to it, even in the same color, I just draw something very sharp, and I even make the extra effort to make it perfectly straight up and down, you can see that contrast happening already, right? Your eye is just naturally drawn towards here, and the reason being is because our eyes actually just naturally like clean, hard shaped edges. So if I filled this picture with just some cloudy imagery, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be a scene necessarily here. And now I come in and I draw anything, and I don't know, let's just say I want to draw a small hot air balloon or something, right? So here we go. You guys can immediately see that contrast, right? It's super small. I mean, I drew it in 2 seconds, but the contrast is there, and your eye immediately just boom goes right to this clean edge. But this doesn't necessarily mean the only way to show texture contrast is through like really blurry effects and stuff. You can actually do it too, just in a loose painterly way, which brings us to texture details. So again, I'm going to come in here and draw a really bad landscape here really quickly, just to kind of illustrate the point of what I'm trying to say. And we're going to try to throw some things in here, and I want some loose elements, but you guys can see I'm using a sharper brush, right? So I want this picture to be sharp. I want everything in the picture to be recognizable, identifiable, etc. and I want you guys to see that just things don't have to necessarily be blurry or not understandable of what it is in order for it to make sense. So I'm just kind of coming in, I'm going to fill this in really quick, and then we'll talk about what I mean when it comes to detail. So here we have a very loose and pretty bad landscape, right? So some sort of desert thing going on. Now, it's all very loose, very kind of just organic, natural, lumpy. What happens when we add something that's detailed? So let's say that someone is here and they're camping, and I did decide to use a color that just kind of is a little bit contrasting. And I came in and I spent some time trying to detail and keep this tent sharp. And you guys can see that, even if I just come in and outline this, something's off, right? And it's not the fact that this picture's super bad and this perspective makes no sense. Just bear with me for a second here. It's the fact that I went in and I hyper detailed this tent in this scenery. So we have some really loose, just kind of painterly thrown in backgrounds, landscape going on. And then suddenly we have a blue tent that is outlined and detailed and clear, right? Everything else kind of seems a little out of focus. This is more clear. Our eyes now are drawn to this tent. You can definitely see this in pictures where people have very rural landscapes and they draw maybe like a cabin in the woods kind of a situation. So shape is pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to keep this very simple. I'm just going to use black. I'm going to fill this page with squares. So now we have a bunch of squares just kind of all over. They're all black, so it kind of just combines, and we can see that it's just angular shapes going on. We know there's squares, right? So all we have to do to have a shape contrast is to put something in here that is very different. So something that is pretty different from a square would be a circle. So maybe not as immediate as some of the other contrasting shapes, but if you just look at this picture for a second, your eye is going to immediately lock onto that circle, and your brain's just going to kind of say, wait, why is that there? Why is there a round thing amongst all these rigid square shapes? So this is essentially shape contrast in a nutshell. And if you've been following along so far, you know that we'd actually have a much better contrast if you're going for that, if we just threw it in here and we made it white. So now we have the best of the value contrast going on. And even though there is white all around it, your eye is still immediately just drawn to this circle because it's wondering, wait a second, why is everything else here so square and this is nice and round? Lastly, on our contrast journey, we have shape and form of size, right? So this is probably going to be exactly what you think. Did you guys get it? I mean, it's pretty much written right in the name. So size is basically just what it is. You're going to have a bigger object next to a smaller object. They can be the same shape, but because there's such a vast difference in the size of them, there is a contrast there, and your eye in this case is going to be jumping back and forth because one is huge and dominating and then one is nice and small. So your eye just kind of flips back and forth. If you wanted a solid contrast here between one of them, you can do something like this where you create a whole bunch of one of them. Could have been the big one, but I went with the small one. And now because there is a majority of small circles, you are now going to look at this one as the focal or the contrasting point because it's like, why is there one giant one? Before I close this video out, I just want to make the point that I purposely made this video very simple in concept so that you can take the simple and apply it to whatever you want. As an example, this was my example for hue and saturation, and here is an artist known as Van Gogh, maybe you've heard of him, using that same concept within one of his wonderful paintings. So again, don't think that I'm saying, hey, this is how you do contrast, and you can only do it with squares and blocks and circles. This is just a concept that should then be applied to whatever you can think of. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Again, I just wanted to keep it simple, like I said, so that way I wasn't kind of steering any ideas, and I want you guys to practice this in your own art completely originally. So if you can, let me see those somehow. It would be really cool. Otherwise, let me know in the comments what you thought, if you guys have any ideas for future videos, and of course, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.